The first person to recognize me at the White House wasn't a politician. It wasn't a senator. It wasn't even the Secretary of the Navy. It was a young protocol officer standing beside the registration desk. Her eyes widened the moment she scanned my invitation. Then she immediately straightened. "Ma'am, you've arrived." The nervousness in her voice caught everyone's attention, especially my father's. Just seconds earlier, he had been smiling. Not proudly. Smugly. He was holding his guest badge in one hand while speaking to another attendee. "You know how these things work," he had said. "Family members are usually invited because of people like me." The man beside him politely nodded. My father continued. "My daughter is attending, of course, but honestly, I'm probably more excited than she is." He laughed. A few people laughed with him. Then the young officer looked up from the scanner. Everything changed. She immediately stepped away from the desk. A nearby captain noticed. Then a commander. Then an admiral standing across the room turned toward us. The admiral started walking directly in my direction. My father stopped talking. The smile disappeared. Confusion replaced it. I stood quietly. The admiral reached me and extended his hand. "Captain Sophia Bennett." His smile was genuine. "It is an honor to finally meet you." Around us, several officers immediately straightened. The protocol officer visibly relaxed. The admiral continued. "We've been expecting you." My father stared. Expecting me. Not him. Not some politician. Me. I shook the admiral's hand. "Thank you, sir." For a brief moment, nobody spoke. Then the memories returned. Not because of the White House. Not because of the ceremony. Because moments like that don't begin in Washington. They begin decades earlier. Usually in places nobody notices. Mine began in a small town in North Carolina. One traffic light. One church. One high school. And one father who spent most of my childhood waiting for a son to become extraordinary. My name is Sophia Bennett. I am 39 years old. And for most of my life I lived in the shadow of someone else's expectations. My father, Thomas Bennett, wasn't a monster. That's important to understand. People hear stories like mine and imagine cruelty. Screaming. Abuse. Violence. None of that happened. My father worked hard. Paid bills. Fixed things around the house. Never missed a day of work. To everyone outside our family, he looked like a good man. In many ways, he was. The problem wasn't what he did. It was who he noticed. And who he didn't. Everything changed when my younger brother Ryan was born. I was 6 years old. Old enough to remember life before him. Old enough to recognize the difference afterward. Ryan wasn't just a son. He was the sun. The future. The legacy. The dream. My father never said those words out loud. He didn't need to. Children notice everything. Especially what adults think they're hiding. I remember bringing home a science fair ribbon in 4th grade. Not first place. Second. I had spent weeks building the project. Researching. Testing. Rebuilding it twice after mistakes. I carried it into the kitchen, with the excitement only a child can have. "Dad, look!" He glanced up from the newspaper. "That's nice." Then Ryan ran into the room carrying a baseball glove. Immediately Dad smiled. "Ready to practice, buddy?" Just like that, the moment was gone. I stood there holding my ribbon. Waiting. Nothing else came. Years later, I realized that memory wasn't important because it was unusual. It mattered because it was normal. Our living room told the story better than words. Ryan's trophies covered entire shelves. Photographs of his games lined the walls. Framed newspaper clippings celebrated every small athletic achievement. Visitors couldn't miss them. My accomplishments existed mostly in drawers. Report cards. Certificates. Awards. Nobody displayed them. Nobody discussed them. Nobody asked. At first, I blamed myself. Children almost always do. Maybe I wasn't impressive enough. Maybe I needed better grades. Maybe I needed bigger achievements. Maybe if I worked harder, eventually Dad would notice. That belief followed me for years. The only person who saw through it was my mother. Eleanor Bennett. My mother possessed a quiet strength that is difficult to describe. She wasn't loud. She wasn't dramatic. She wasn't the kind of person who demanded attention. Yet somehow, whenever she entered a room, people felt calmer. Sophia. Understood. Especially me. One evening after another baseball tournament where my father spent the entire drive home praising Ryan's performance, I sat alone on my bed. I was 13, old enough to recognize disappointment, young enough to still hope things might change. A soft knock came from the door. "Can I come in?" "Mom." I nodded. She sat beside me without speaking. For several moments, neither of us said anything. Then she gently placed her hand over mine. "You're hurting." "Not a question. A fact." I stared at the floor. "I'm okay." She smiled sadly. "No, sweetheart." The tears came immediately. I hated that. I hated crying. But somehow, mothers always know where the cracks are. "He doesn't care what I do." The words escaped before I could stop them. Mom remained quiet, choosing her response carefully. Finally, she spoke. "Your father loves you." I laughed bitterly. Even at 13, I knew that wasn't the same thing. She understood. "I know," she said softly. "Then why doesn't he see me?" That question lingered between us. A question millions of children have asked throughout history. Why doesn't the person I love see me? Mum Sahil. Because sometimes people get trapped inside ideas they learned a long time ago. What does that mean? She looked toward the window. It means your father believes sons and daughters should become different things. I frowned. That's stupid. To my surprise, Mom laughed. A real laugh. Then she squeezed my hand. Yes. I looked at her. Then why doesn't he change? Her expression softened. Because changing is harder than people think. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she turned toward me completely. Sophia. I looked up. One day, people are going to see exactly who you are. I rolled my eyes. It sounded like something written inside greeting cards. The kind of thing parents say because they don't know what else to say. But Mom wasn't smiling. She meant it. Absolutely. Completely. She believed it. And somehow that made me want to believe it too. At the time, neither of us knew how important those words would become. My mother's words stayed with me longer than my father's disappointments. At 13, I didn't fully understand why. I only knew that whenever life became difficult, her voice seemed louder than everyone else's. That voice became even more important 2 years later. Because that was when everything started changing. At 15, I got my first job. Not because I wanted spending money. Because I needed it. Ryan's baseball career was becoming more expensive every year. Travel teams, private coaching, specialized equipment, tournament fees. Whenever something involved Ryan, money somehow appeared. When I needed something, the answer was usually different. "We can't afford that right now." I heard that sentence so often I could predict it before it was spoken. New calculator for school? Can't afford it. Summer leadership program? Can't afford it. Academic competition trip? Can't afford it. Meanwhile, another baseball bat would magically appear in the garage a week later. I noticed. Of course I noticed. But eventually I stopped mentioning it. There wasn't much point. So I started babysitting. Then waitressing. Then tutoring younger students. Whatever paid. Whatever helped. Whatever allowed me to stop depending on someone who had already decided where his priorities belonged. Oddly enough, that independence became one of the greatest gifts I ever received. Though I certainly didn't see it that way at the time. The person who did see it was my mother. One evening, after I came home exhausted from a long shift at a local diner, she was waiting at the kitchen table. A cup of hot chocolate sat beside her. My favorite. She smiled when I walked in. Long day? I dropped into a chair. You could say that. She slid the mug toward me. I wrapped my hands around it. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she asked quietly, "Do you ever wish things were different?" I laughed. "Every day." She nodded. "Me too." That surprised me. "You do?" "Of course." I frowned. "You never seem upset." Her smile widened slightly. "Sophia, not being angry and not being disappointed are two different things." I thought about that for a long moment. Years later, I would realize how much wisdom was hidden inside simple sentences. At 16, I only knew she sounded tired. A year later, everything changed. The first signs were small. A doctor's appointment here. A medical test there. Occasionnelle fatigue. Nothing alarming. At least not initially. Then came more appointments. More tests. More silence. And eventually, a diagnosis. Cancer? Even now, I hate that word. I hate the way it changes a room, the way it steals oxygen, the way it immediately divides life into before and after. For months, Mom fought. Treatments, appointments, hospital visits, good days, bad days, hope, fear, all tangled together. Through it all, she somehow remained the strongest person in the family. Stronger than Dad, stronger than Ryan, stronger than me. I remember sitting beside her hospital bed one rainy afternoon. Machines hummed quietly. Rain tapped against the window. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee. Mom looked tired, but her eyes remained clear, steady. Certain, the same eyes that had guided me my entire life. She reached for my hand. Sophia. I immediately felt tears building. I hated crying in front of her. She squeezed my fingers gently. Promise me something. What? Never let someone else's opinion decide your future. I swallowed hard. I promise. She smiled. Then she added something that would follow me for decades. One day they'll see who you really are. At the time I thought she meant my father. I thought she meant Ryan. I thought she meant our town. I didn't understand she was talking about something much bigger. Something neither of us could yet see. 3 months before graduation, my mother passed away. The world kept moving. I didn't. Not for a while. The funeral blurred together. Flowers. Visitors. Church hymns. Sympathetic faces. Endless casseroles arriving at the house. Everyone said the same things. She was wonderful. She'll always be with you. She's in a better place. Maybe all of it was true. It didn't make the house feel any less empty. For the first time in my life, I truly felt alone. The one person who always noticed me was gone. And without her, the imbalance inside our family became impossible to ignore. Dad threw himself into work. Ryan buried himself in sports. I buried myself in school. Nobody talked about grief. We simply carried it separately. 1 month after her funeral, I found something hidden inside an old cedar chest in her closet. A letter. My name was written on the front. My hands shook before I even opened it. Inside was a handwritten note. Only a few paragraphs. Yet those paragraphs changed my life. One sentence stood out immediately. Never let someone else's opinion become your destiny. I stared at those words for a long time. Then I read them again. And again. And again. Whenever life became difficult after that, I returned to them. They became a compass. A reminder. A promise. Graduation arrived later that spring. Families filled the auditorium. Parents cheered. Cameras flashed. Students celebrated. I searched the crowd instinctively, looking for Mom. For one brief second, I forgot. Then reality returned. The empty seat beside my father felt larger than the entire auditorium. I accepted my diploma, smiled for photographs, and fought back tears. Afterward, relatives congratulated Ryan on an upcoming baseball showcase tournament. Very few asked about my future. By then, I was accustomed to it. College seemed impossible financially. Most of the family's resources were already committed elsewhere. One evening, I sat at the kitchen table surrounded by scholarship applications, essay forms, financial documents, recommendation letters. Stacks of paperwork covered every surface. Dad walked through the kitchen. He glanced at the papers. "What are those?" "Scholarship applications." He nodded, then shrugged. "Probably your only chance." Not cruel, not encouraging, just indifferent. Somehow that made it worse. For several seconds after he walked away, I stared at the applications. Part of me wanted to quit. Part of me wanted to throw them all away. Then I remembered Mom's letter. Never let someone else's opinion become your destiny. I picked up my pen and kept writing. Every night, every weekend, every spare moment. I applied for everything. Academic scholarships, leadership scholarships, military scholarships, community grants, programs I had never even heard of before. Months later, acceptance letters started arriving. One, then another, then another. Eventually, I had enough funding to attend college without asking anyone for help. Not because someone believed in me, because I refused to stop believing in myself. And without realizing it, I had just taken the first step toward becoming the woman who would one day walk through the gates of the White House. College taught me something my childhood never could. Nobody cared who your father was. Nobody cared who received more attention growing up. Nobody cared who had been overlooked. The only thing that mattered was what you did when nobody was watching. For the first time in my life, that felt liberating. Most students spent weekends at football games, parties, and campus events. I spent mine working, waitressing, tutoring, stocking inventory at a local store. Whatever paid. Whatever kept me moving forward. At first I resented it. Then something unexpected happened. I became stronger. Not physically, mentally. There is a unique confidence that develops when you solve your own problems repeatedly. A confidence that cannot be borrowed from family, cannot be gifted, cannot be inherited. It has to be earned. And every difficult semester earned a little more of it. During my sophomore year, life delivered another surprise. Ryan's baseball career began falling apart. A serious shoulder injury changed everything. The doctors weren't optimistic. Neither were the scouts. Years of expectations suddenly sat on unstable ground. For the first time in my life, I saw fear in my father's eyes. Real fear. Not for me. For Ryan. The future he had imagined was disappearing. The son who was supposed to accomplish extraordinary things was struggling. Dad became restless, frustrated, short-tempered. It was as if someone had taken away the map he'd been following for 20 years. Meanwhile, something unusual was happening to me. I was quietly building a future nobody expected, including me. One afternoon, while sorting through old family photographs, I found a picture of my mother sitting on our front porch. She was holding a coffee mug, smiling at whoever was behind the camera, probably me. I sat there for nearly an hour staring at that photograph. Not crying, not grieving, thinking, what would she say if she could see me now? Working, studying, refusing to quit, still moving forward despite everything. The answer came easily. She'd be proud. Not because of success, because of persistence. That realization carried me through the rest of college. When graduation finally arrived, I walked across the stage with honors. No fanfare, no dramatic moment. Just quiet satisfaction. I had done it. On my own. After the ceremony, Dad congratulated me. Briefly, Ryan shook my hand. A few relatives asked what came next. I didn't know exactly. Only that I wanted more. More challenge. More opportunity. More purpose. A few months later, while searching job listings online, I saw 4 words that changed my life. United States Navy recruiting. I almost ignored it. Almost. The recruiting office sat between a sandwich shop and a tax service office in a small shopping center. Nothing about it looked impressive. There were no dramatic flags. No movie-style speeches. No grand promises. Just a recruiter sitting behind a desk. He looked up when I walked in. What brings you here? I sat down. For a moment, I wasn't sure how to answer. Then the truth came out. I want a future. He smiled. That's a good place to start. A few months later, I raised my right hand and took the oath. My father didn't attend. He wasn't against it. He simply wasn't interested enough to rearrange his schedule. Ryan happened to be available. So he came. Afterward, Dad called. Be careful. That was the entire conversation. 3 words. I remember sitting alone in my apartment afterward, holding the small navy pin they had given me. Part of me wished my mother could see it. Not because of the uniform, because of what it represented. Opportunity. Independence. A chance to build something entirely my own. Training was harder than anything I had ever experienced. The Navy doesn't care about excuses. It doesn't care about your childhood. It doesn't care who believed in you, or who didn't. It only cares about performance. That honesty appealed to me immediately. For the first time in my life, expectations were simple. Work, learn, improve, lead, earn respect. Nobody compared me to Ryan. Nobody asked whether I was living up to someone else's dream. The playing field was finally level. Of course, not everyone welcomed me. Some people saw a young woman and assumed weakness. Others assumed I wouldn't last. A few made sure I knew exactly what they thought. At first, I tried explaining myself, trying to prove them wrong. Eventually, I learned something important. Performance speaks louder than arguments. So I stopped talking and started working. Harder, longer, smarter. When others relaxed, I studied. When others complained, I prepared. When others doubted me, I improved. The results came slowly, then all at once. Promotions, assignments, leadership opportunities, recommendations, recognition. People who once ignored me started paying attention. People who doubted me started asking for help. One afternoon, after receiving a significant promotion, I called my father. I don't know why. Maybe some small part of me still hoped, still wanted that approval, that pride, that acknowledgement. "Dad, I got promoted." There was a pause. Then his answer came. "That's nice." Exactly the same words. The same words he'd used after my science fair ribbon. The same words he'd used after dozens of achievements. "That's nice." For a second, I almost laughed. Some things never changed. The difference was that I had. After we hung up, I sat quietly in my apartment. Not angry, not hurt, just aware. Aware that I was still occasionally expecting something he didn't know how to give. Once I accepted that, life became easier. The years that followed changed everything. Assignments came and went. I moved across the country, served under remarkable leaders, learned lessons no classroom could teach, made friends who became family, lost some people along the way. Each experience strengthened something inside me. Confidence, not loud confidence, quiet confidence. The kind that comes from surviving difficult things, the kind that no one can take away. Then came the mission that altered the course of my career. A devastating natural disaster struck a coastal region overseas. Entire communities were destroyed. Families lost everything. Thousands needed help. For weeks, our team worked around the clock, delivering aid, coordinating evacuations, providing medical support, rebuilding critical infrastructure. I watched sailors carry elderly survivors through floodwaters, comfort frightened children, solve impossible problems under impossible conditions. Those weeks reminded me why I loved serving. Leadership wasn't about rank. It was about responsibility. At the time, I thought I was simply doing my job. I had no idea that mission would later become one of the reasons people in Washington began paying attention. Years passed. Promotion followed promotion. Assignment followed assignment. And somewhere along the way, something unexpected happened. I stopped trying to prove my father wrong. Success wasn't revenge. Success was freedom. Freedom from old disappointments. Freedom from needing approval. Freedom to become exactly who I wanted to be. Then one evening, everything changed. I came home after a long day, opened my mailbox, and found a large envelope from Washington, D.C. At first, I assumed it was routine military paperwork. Another administrative document. Another report. I almost tossed it onto the kitchen counter unopened. Instead, I made a cup of coffee, sat down, and opened it. Within seconds, my heart started racing. Because what I found inside was something I never expected to see. An official invitation from the White House. For several minutes, I simply stared at the invitation. The coffee on my kitchen table had gone cold. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. But I barely noticed. My attention remained fixed on the letter. The White House. Even after years in the Navy, the words felt unreal. Not because I doubted my accomplishments, because the White House belonged to history books, to presidents, to moments that seemed larger than ordinary life. It didn't feel like a place where a girl from a tiny North Carolina town was supposed to end up, especially not a girl who had spent half her childhood trying to be noticed by her own father. Eventually, I laughed softly. Then I read the invitation again, this time more carefully. The recognition wasn't tied to one mission, or one deployment, or one promotion. It reflected years of service, leadership, humanitarian work, community impact. Somewhere along the way, people had been paying attention even when I wasn't. That realization touched me more than the invitation itself. The next morning, I called the number listed on the letter. After confirming several details, the coordinator assured me there had been no mistake. Everything was real. The ceremony, the recognition, the invitation. Washington was expecting me. After the call ended, I sat quietly for a long moment. Then I looked toward a framed photograph sitting on a shelf. My mother, smiling, holding a coffee cup on the front porch of our old house. I smiled back. "Mom," I whispered. They finally noticed. The room fell silent again. For a brief moment, I imagined what she would say. Probably something simple, something wise, something that would remind me the recognition wasn't the important part. She always had a way of seeing the bigger picture. Later that afternoon, I called my father. Part of me considered not telling him. Not because I wanted revenge, because we simply weren't very close. But something inside me said he deserved to know. He answered on the third ring. "Hello? Hi, Dad. Sophia." I explained the invitation, the ceremony, the recognition. By the time I finished, there was a long silence. Then another. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded different. "The White House?" "Yes." Another pause. Then he said something I hadn't heard in years. "Wow. Not amazing. Not congratulations. But still, progress." Over the following week, he called several times. More than he had in the previous 6 months combined. At first I found it amusing. Then slightly suspicious. Then predictable. Eventually he asked the question I knew was coming. "Can family members attend?" I laughed. "Sometimes. Would there be room for me?" There it was. The same father who rarely asked about my assignments suddenly wanted details. Old resentment briefly surfaced, then disappeared. Holding on to it seemed pointless. "Yes," I said. "There will be room." His excitement was immediate. A few days later he called again. My invitation arrived. He sounded like a child on Christmas morning. I smiled despite myself. Not because he was proud of me, because he was excited about the event. There is a difference. Still, I let it go. Life becomes easier when you stop demanding perfection from imperfect people. A week before the ceremony, I drove home to visit him. The old house looked smaller than I remembered. Funny how that happens. Places shrink while memories grow. Dad was waiting on the porch when I arrived. His hair was mostly gray now. His movements, slower. For the first time, I truly noticed his age. Growing older has a way of humbling everyone. Even fathers. Ryan was there too. We spent the evening drinking coffee around the kitchen table. The conversation stayed pleasant. Mostly. Ryan asked about my work. Dad asked about Washington. Almost exclusively Washington. Who would be there? Would military leaders attend? Would there be admirals? Would there be photographs? The more questions he asked, the more excited he became. By the end of the evening, he seemed more invested in the ceremony than I was. The irony wasn't lost on me. Years earlier, he could barely remember details about my promotions. Now he practically memorized the event schedule. That night I stayed in my old bedroom. Most of my childhood belongings were gone. But a few things remained, including a small wooden box hidden in the back of the closet. Inside was my mother's letter, the original, carefully folded, protected all these years. I sat on the edge of the bed and read it again. The paper had yellowed slightly, the ink had faded, but the message remained unchanged. Never let someone else's opinion become your destiny. I smiled, then looked around the room. This room had witnessed so much disappointment, so many tears, so many moments where I wondered whether I would ever matter. And yet somehow it had also witnessed determination, growth, resilience. The girl who once cried herself to sleep here would never have imagined what came next. A few days later, Dad and I boarded a flight to Washington. The entire trip felt surreal. At the airport, Dad proudly told strangers about the White House ceremony. Several people congratulated him. He accepted the congratulations without correcting them. I noticed. Of course I noticed. But I simply smiled. Some habits take a lifetime to break. When we arrived in Washington, the city looked beautiful. Historic buildings, tree-lined streets, monuments rising against the skyline. Even after years of travel, Washington still carried a certain energy, a sense that important things happened there. That evening we checked into our hotel. The lobby buzzed with military personnel, government officials, and guests attending various events. Dad spent half the evening talking to complete strangers. Whenever they asked why he was visiting, he proudly mentioned the White House. Sometimes he mentioned me. Sometimes he didn't. Oddly enough, I wasn't angry, just amused. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. Years in the Navy had made that routine. I stood beside the hotel window watching the city come alive. Traffic moved below. Lights flickered on. Workers headed toward their offices. Tourists filled the sidewalks. And somewhere beyond the buildings stood the White House. Waiting. A strange calm settled over me. Not excitement. Not nervousness. Gratitude. Whatever happened today, I had already won. Not because of an award. Because I had become the person my mother always believed I could be. A few hours later, we left for the ceremony. Dad adjusted his tie repeatedly, checked his invitation 3 times, then carefully placed it back inside his jacket pocket. As our car approached the White House grounds, he looked almost giddy. I couldn't help smiling. Neither of us knew it yet, but before the day ended, everything he believed about his daughter was about to change. The White House grounds were magnificent. Security checkpoints, historic architecture, uniformed personnel moving with quiet efficiency. The atmosphere carried a mixture of anticipation and dignity. Dad seemed to enjoy every second of it. As we approached the registration area, he removed his VIP invitation. The gold lettering gleamed beneath the lights. He held it up proudly. Then he looked at me. A familiar smirk appeared. One I hadn't seen in years. "You know," he said casually, "I guess technically you're only here because of me." A nearby guest chuckled politely. Dad smiled. Then he added, "Looks like I'm the important one today." For a brief moment, 13-year-old Sophia returned. The girl holding a ribbon. The girl waiting to be seen. But only for a moment. Because that girl was gone. I simply handed my invitation to the protocol officer. She scanned it. The scanner beeped. Then her expression changed completely. Everything stopped. And seconds later, an admiral began walking directly toward me. The admiral moved through the crowd with the kind of presence that immediately changes a room. Conversations stopped. People stepped aside. Several officers standing nearby straightened instinctively. My father's smile vanished. Confusion appeared first. Then uncertainty. Then something I had rarely seen on his face. Concern. The admiral walked directly toward me. Not toward my father. Not toward one of the politicians. Toward me. When he stopped in front of me, a broad smile spread across his face. "Captain Sophia Bennett." He extended his hand. "It is an honor to finally meet you." I shook it. "Thank you, sir." The admiral nodded. "We've been looking forward to this day." Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my father freeze. The words seemed to hit him physically. Looking forward to this day. Not because of him. Because of me. The protocol officer stepped aside. Several senior officials approached. One after another. Greeting me by name. Mentioning assignments. Operations. Leadership programs. Humanitarian missions. People my father had never met. People who somehow knew more about my life than he did. At one point, he leaned closer and whispered, "How do all these people know you?" I smiled gently. "We've worked together." He nodded slowly. Still trying to process everything. Eventually, we entered the main hall. American flags lined the stage. Military banners stood proudly along the walls. Rows of carefully arranged seats stretched across the room. An usher approached immediately. "Captain Bennett, right this way." She guided me toward the front. Very front. The section reserved for honorees. My father stopped walking. "What is this?" I turned toward him. "This is where they asked me to sit." His eyes widened. For perhaps the first time in his life, he understood. I wasn't attending the event. I was one of the reasons it existed. The ceremony began. Senior officials delivered remarks. Military leaders spoke about service. Public servants were recognized. Then my name was announced. The applause filled the room. For a second, I couldn't move. Not because of the recognition, because suddenly I saw every version of myself that had led to this moment. The little girl carrying a ribbon. The teenager filling out scholarship applications. The young recruit raising her right hand. The officer studying late at night while others slept. The daughter reading her mother's letter over and over again. They were all standing on that stage with me. The citation was read aloud. Leadership, service, humanitarian response, community impact, mentorship. Each achievement represented years of effort. Years nobody had noticed. Or so I once believed. As I accepted the recognition, My eyes drifted toward the audience, toward my father. He wasn't smiling politely. He wasn't pretending. He looked emotional, genuinely emotional. For the first time in my life, I saw pride in his eyes, real pride, directed at me. The realization was almost harder to process than the award itself. When the ceremony ended, guests gathered throughout the hall. Conversations filled the room. Photographs were taken. Hands were shaken. The Admiral stopped by before leaving. "It was a privilege honoring you today, Captain." "Thank you, sir." Then he glanced toward my father. The Admiral smiled warmly. "You raised an extraordinary daughter." My father lowered his eyes. For a moment, he looked almost ashamed. After the Admiral left, neither of us spoke. Finally, he cleared his throat. "I didn't know." His voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. I looked at him. "What didn't you know?" He laughed softly. "Any of it. For years I had imagined this moment. Imagined what I would say. Imagined confronting him. Imagined proving him wrong. Yet standing there, none of that seemed important anymore. Because the truth was already obvious. "I know," I said quietly. Those two words hit him harder than anger ever could. We left the building together. Outside, the afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the White House grounds. For several minutes we simply walked. Then he stopped beside a bench. "I owe you an apology." The words sounded awkward, unpracticed, as if he had spent decades avoiding them. I waited. He sat down slowly, staring at the ground. "When you were little, I thought I understood how life worked. I listened. I thought sons carried the family legacy." A bitter smile crossed his face. "I thought sons were supposed to accomplish great things." The irony hung between us. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he continued. "I spent years waiting for Ryan to become the person I imagined." His voice cracked. "And while I was doing that, I completely missed who you already were." The honesty stunned me, not because it erased the past, because it acknowledged it. Finally, for the first time, I sat beside him. The breeze moved gently through nearby trees. People passed in the distance. Life continued, as it always does. "I remember your science fair ribbon." I looked at him in surprise. "The one in 4th grade." I blinked. "You remember that?" He nodded. "I remember your face." For years I believed he hadn't noticed. Apparently he had. That realization hurt and healed at the same time. "I knew I disappointed you," he said quietly. "I just never admitted it." We continued walking through the gardens. Eventually he stopped again. "I think your mother knew." "Knew what?" A sad smile touched his face. "Who you were going to become." I laughed softly. "She did." He nodded. "She used to tell me all the time." I smiled. "What did she say?" He looked toward the trees. Then repeated words I hadn't heard in years. "One day you'll see what that girl is capable of." For a moment I could hear my mother's voice as clearly as if she were standing beside us. Neither of us spoke. The silence felt necessary, like a bridge being rebuilt, one board at a time. Finally he turned toward me. "I can't get those years back." "No. I can't change what I did." "No." He nodded sadly. Then asked the only question that mattered. "But can we move forward?" I thought about my mother, about the letter, about everything that had happened. Then I smiled. A real smile. "Yeah, Dad." Relief washed across his face. Not victory. Relief. Months later, we visited my mother's grave together. The cemetery sat on a quiet hill outside town, the same place she had been resting for years. We carried white flowers, her favorite. For several minutes we stood silently. The wind moved through the trees. Birds sang somewhere nearby. Dad reached into his jacket, then carefully removed something folded. The White House ceremony program. Without saying a word, he placed it beside the flowers. Then he looked down at the headstone. His voice trembled. "You were right." The words hung in the air. Simple. Honest. Long overdue. I should have listened. For a moment I thought he might cry. Part of me almost did. Not because of the White House. Not because of the recognition. Because after all those years, he finally understood what my mother had known from the beginning. Potential doesn't belong to sons. Or daughters. It belongs to people. Every child deserves to be seen. As we walked back toward the car, I realized something. The White House had never been the victory. The award wasn't the victory. The applause wasn't the victory. The real victory was becoming the woman my mother believed I could become without allowing bitterness to define me. The real victory was carrying her faith forward when nobody else did. The real victory was learning that forgiveness is not forgetting. It's choosing not to let old pain control the future. Years ago, I thought success would finally make my father see me. What I learned instead was something much more important. Success doesn't change who you are. It reveals who you've become. And because of my mother's love, I became stronger than my disappointment. Stronger than rejection. Stronger than the need for approval. The girl who once stood invisible in her own home had become impossible to overlook. And the woman who saw that future first wasn't an admiral, wasn't a president, wasn't even me. It was my mother. She saw it long before anyone else ever could.